You like the Whiskey and Wildflowers storyline, where Roisin and Aisling are on a road trip together, slowly realizing their mutual attraction. Below is an outline and the beginning of the story. Whiskey and Wildflowers, story outline. Setting: the Irish countryside, with stops in quaint villages, rolling green hills, hidden meadows, and rustic pubs. Plot: Roisin and Aisling are two very different women with a shared friend. They're both invited to this friend's wedding, but neither has transportation to the remote location. Reluctantly, they agree to travel together, each seeing the other as an obstacle rather than an opportunity. But the open road, with its twists, surprises, and breathtaking views, brings out sides of each other they hadn't expected. Themes: discovery, discovering the beauty in each other's differences. Growth, letting go of personal hang-ups and fears about love. Acceptance, learning to embrace someone who defies expectations. Whiskey and Wildflowers, opening scene. The air was crisp with morning mist, clinging to the winding roads that stretched through the Irish countryside. Roisin adjusted her hat, taking one last drag of her cigar before flicking it into the gravel and stamping it out with her boot. She leaned against her battered old car, a little blue hatchback she affectionately called Babin, that looked as scrappy as she did, with patches of rust and a paint job that had seen better days. "Are you serious?" came a voice from behind her. Roisin turned, smirking as Aisling approached, looking as put together as ever. Dressed in a flowing floral dress and ankle boots, Aisling seemed like she'd been plucked straight from a magazine, all softness and gentle grace, a stark contrast to Roisin's plaid shirt, jeans, and well-worn hat. "I'm always serious," Roisin replied, crossing her arms. "You ready for this?" Aisling glanced at the car, raising an eyebrow. "Is that safe to drive?" Roisin laughed, patting the hood of the hatchback. "She's as solid as they come. She's got personality, unlike some people I know." She shot Aisling a teasing look, which was met with a quiet sigh. "I don't know how I let them talk me into this," Aisling murmured, clutching her purse tightly. "It's a 4-hour drive at least, and we barely know each other." "Consider it an adventure," Roisin said with a shrug. "Besides, you're not scared, are you?" Aisling straightened, giving her a cool look. "I'm not scared. I just prefer a little more predictability, that's all." "Well, you're in luck," Roisin replied with a grin. "Predictably, I drive. And unpredictably, we'll see where the road takes us." With a reluctant sigh, Aisling slid into the passenger seat, adjusting her dress carefully as she fastened the seatbelt. Roisin climbed into the driver's seat, pulling on her aviator sunglasses and starting the engine, which roared to life with a surprising vigor that made Aisling's eyebrows lift. As they pulled onto the narrow country road, the initial silence between them was filled only by the hum of the engine and the soft folk music Roisin had playing from an old cassette deck. After a few minutes, Roisin glanced over, noticing how Aisling was already fidgeting, clearly uncomfortable in the silence. "So," Roisin said, breaking the tension with a sideways smile, "what's a girl like you doing heading off to a wedding all alone?" Aisling looked out the window, her fingers twisting in her lap. "Not all of us are lucky enough to have someone to take along." I didn't mean it like that," Roisin said, her voice softening a bit. "Just thought maybe you'd have some charming lad waiting to sweep you off your feet." Aisling gave a small, tight smile. "Not everyone needs to be swept off their feet, you know." Roisin chuckled, glancing back at the road. "Fair enough. But sometimes it's nice to let your feet leave the ground, if only for a little while." They fell into silence again, but this time it was softer, easier. As the landscape unfolded around them, green hills dotted with sheep and fields of wildflowers stretching into the horizon, the divide between them began to feel less like a barrier and more like a bridge. They made their first stop in a tiny village with one pub, a shop, and little else. Inside the pub, Aisling ordered a quiet cup of tea, while Roisin grabbed a small bottle of whiskey from the bar, giving her a wink. "To the journey," Roisin said, raising her bottle. Aisling lifted her teacup, shaking her head but smiling despite herself. to surviving the journey. As they clinked their glasses, Roisin's eyes sparkled with mischief. Oh, we'll do more than survive. By the end of this, Aisling, you might just see that a little unpredictability can be good for the soul. Aisling smiled, feeling a strange warmth she couldn't quite explain. I suppose anything's possible. Whiskey and Wildflowers, Chapter 2, The Meadow and the Guitar. After a few more hours of winding roads and scenic views, Roisin took a sudden turn onto a narrow dirt path, the little car bumping along as Aisling grabbed the door handle, alarm flashing across her face. Where are we going? Aisling asked, glancing over at her with a mixture of curiosity and mild exasperation. Roisin grinned, not looking away from the makeshift path she'd chosen. Trust me. Aisling sighed, settling back in her seat. I should know better than to trust a woman who smokes cigars and drives with one hand on the wheel. Oh, come on, live a little, Roisin replied, her tone warm and teasing. Besides, we've been driving forever. We deserve a break. Before Aisling could protest, they rolled to a stop in a small clearing surrounded by fields of wildflowers. The sun was beginning to sink low, casting a soft golden glow over the landscape. Roisin hopped out, stretching her arms above her head, while Aisling hesitated, looking around as though expecting someone to jump out and say they were trespassing. Relax, Roisin said, noticing her unease. This is as good a place as any to stretch our legs. Plus, it's quiet. Beautiful, isn't it? Aisling stepped out of the car, taking in the sight. The meadow stretched as far as the eye could see, wildflowers swaying gently in the evening breeze. She breathed in deeply, the scent of grass and flowers filling her senses. It really is beautiful. Roisin walked to the trunk, pulling out an old, battered guitar. Aisling raised an eyebrow as Roisin settled herself on a patch of grass, gesturing for Aisling to join her. You play? Aisling asked, somewhat surprised. Used to, Roisin replied, tuning the strings absent-mindedly. Just a bit, though. My grandfather taught me. She strummed a few chords, the notes ringing out soft and gentle against the backdrop of the open field. Aisling sat down beside her, hugging her knees as she listened. The sun dipped lower, and the light became softer, bathing them in a warm, golden glow. Roisin played a simple melody, something melancholy yet sweet, her fingers moving with a practiced ease that hinted at years of quiet moments spent strumming. Without looking up, Roisin spoke, her voice low and contemplative. You ever feel like you're just drifting? Like you're just going along with things instead of deciding where you actually want to go? Aisling glanced at her, surprised by the shift in tone. Sometimes, she admitted. I suppose I've always done what was expected of me. The safe choices, the predictable path. Roisin looked up, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. Predictable, eh? So what's a predictable girl like you doing on a road trip with me? Aisling felt herself flush, momentarily caught off guard. I could ask you the same question, she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. What's a woman like you, wild and impulsive, doing playing old tunes in a field instead of, well, I don't know. Whatever wild people do. Roisin laughed, a rich sound that made Aisling's stomach flutter. Maybe I'm not as wild as you think, she said, her eyes meeting Aisling's with a hint of something vulnerable. Or maybe I just want someone to see the other side of me, for once. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and Aisling found herself unable to look away. She reached out, tentatively resting her hand over Roisin's. Maybe I'm not as predictable as you think. Roisin's gaze softened, and she squeezed Aisling's hand gently before letting it go, returning her focus to the guitar. She played another song, something upbeat and light this time, a contrast to the mood that had just passed between them. Aisling laughed, clapping along, the tension easing as they fell into an easy rhythm together, each finding comfort in the other's presence. As the sun disappeared behind the hills and stars began to prick through the twilight sky, Roisin set the guitar aside, lying back in the grass and looking up at the heavens. Aisling lay beside her, their shoulders barely touching, each aware of the other's warmth in the cool evening air. Roisin pointed at a particularly bright star. They say that once part of a constellation that used to be a goddess. Legend says she fell in love with a mortal, but was cursed to watch over him from the sky for all eternity. Aisling turned her head, studying Roisin's profile, her heart beating a little faster. That's a sad story. Maybe, Roisin replied, shrugging lightly. Or maybe it's kind of beautiful. Loving someone enough to watch over them, even from a distance. Sometimes, I think love can be just as powerful in the things we don't say or do. Aisling felt a shiver, both from the night air and the intensity in Roisin's voice. She didn't respond, but something shifted between them, an unspoken understanding settling over them like a blanket. They lay there, side by side in the meadow, neither of them speaking as the stars twinkled above, both aware that they were no longer quite the strangers they had been at the start of the journey. In the quiet, in the shared glances and lingering silences, the first fragile roots of something deeper began to take hold. Whiskey and Wildflowers, Chapter 3, The Weight of the Past. As Aisling lay in the meadow beside Roisin, her thoughts drifted back to a different night. Years ago, a night when she'd made a choice that had changed the course of her life. She hadn't thought about Tom or Sean in a long time, not consciously, anyway. But something about Roisin, her daring, her boldness, stirred up memories that Aisling had pushed deep down, memories of a younger version of herself, caught between what she thought she wanted and the wild curiosity that had threatened to undo everything. Tom had been safe. Steady. The sort of man every good Catholic girl dreamed of. They'd had a respectable courtship, filled with long, chaste kisses and hands held in the glow of Sunday Mass. He had a gentle smile and a modest way about him, always kind and respectful. He was, by all accounts, perfect. And for a long time, Aisling had convinced herself she wanted nothing more. But then, Sean had arrived. Sean Green, the best man, was everything Tom wasn't. He was younger, a little reckless, with a sharp wit and a grin that dared you to defy him. The night Tom left town on business, Aisling had found herself alone with Sean at a gathering. She'd tried to keep her distance, tried to remember who she was and the life she was building. But the wine flowed, her defenses faded, and soon, she found herself drawn to his laughter, his warmth. Sean's kisses had been different. They were intense, unfiltered, tasting of whiskey and rebellion. His hands had held her with a confidence she'd never known, and in his arms, she'd felt something raw and electrifying, a freedom that both thrilled and frightened her. He hadn't asked permission, hadn't hesitated, and Aisling, who had always been careful, always predictable, let herself go for the first time in her life. The next morning, as the sun rose and reality set in, Aisling had felt the weight of what she'd done. She knew she couldn't go through with marrying Tom. She couldn't stand at the altar, veiled in white, with a heart that had tasted something so different. Telling Tom had been agonizing, seeing the hurt in his eyes as she explained, haltingly, that she wasn't the woman he thought she was. In the years that followed, Aisling had tried to put that night behind her. She told herself it was a mistake, a brief lapse in judgment. But as she lay beside Roisin now, she felt the same pull, the lure of something wild, something freeing, something beyond the carefully crafted boundaries she'd set for herself. She turned her head, glancing at Roisin, who was still gazing up at the stars with that same carefree smile. Roisin's presence brought back all those old feelings, and yet, this felt different. Roisin wasn't just a thrill, she was a puzzle, a person with layers and a heart that beat as fiercely as her own. "Are you okay?" Roisin asked, turning to look at her. Her voice was soft, but there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. Aisling hesitated, unsure of how much to share. But the memory of her past weighed heavily, the desire to be honest overpowering her fear. "I was just thinking about the past," she said quietly, her fingers brushing over a stray wildflower beside her. "About mistakes. Choices I made. People I hurt." Roisin nodded, her expression shifting to something gentler. "We've all got our ghosts, love. Doesn't mean they get to haunt us forever." Aisling sighed. It's not that simple. I hurt someone good. And sometimes I wonder if that means I don't deserve, well, someone else. Someone who could see all of me. Roisin reached out, her hand resting on Aisling's, grounding her. Listen, we're all a bit messy. You think I haven't left a trail of bad decisions behind me? I've run away more times than I can count. But I figure, if someone's gonna care for me, they deserve to know the real me, the mistakes, the flaws, all of it. Aisling's gaze softened as she looked at her, feeling a strange sense of relief. So you think it's possible? To find someone who sees all of you and doesn't run away? Roisin smiled, squeezing her hand. Well, I'm still here, aren't I? The words lingered in the air, a gentle promise, and for the first time, Aisling felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe she didn't have to keep running from the past. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to let someone in again, someone who would embrace her, flaws and all. As they lay there in the quiet of the meadow, hand in hand, Aisling felt the beginning of something new, a fragile trust, a spark of courage she hadn't felt in years. Roisin's presence wasn't just a reminder of her past mistakes, it was a reminder that perhaps she could choose differently this time. And with that thought, she allowed herself to close her eyes, leaning her head against Roisin's shoulder as the night stretched on, full of unspoken promises and the beauty of second chances. Whiskey and Wildflowers, Chapter 4, Shadows of the Past. The memory was sharp, unbidden, and relentless. Aisling felt its weight pressing against her chest as she lay in the meadow beside Roisin. It was as if the stars above weren't bright enough to chase away the shadows lurking in her mind. Sean's face swam into her consciousness, his eager hands and rough kisses, the way he'd made her feel simultaneously wanted and vulnerable. She had been naive back then, swept up in the thrill of being desired by someone so different from Tom, someone so alive, so raw. Sean had unlocked a part of her she hadn't known existed, but in doing so, he had also exposed the fragility of her inexperience. She remembered the way he'd kissed her, hungry and impatient, leaving no room for second thoughts. Her body had trembled as her dress slipped to the floor, her heart racing as she bared herself to him for the first time. She had felt so brave in that moment, so daring, as if she were finally stepping into a world she had only imagined. But the bravery had faltered when Sean refused her silent plea. His rejection stung more than she had expected, a sharp reminder that she didn't fully understand this game she had stepped into. And then, when he reversed their roles, when he pulled her hair and demanded something she had never imagined, fear had gripped her. She had wanted to please him, wanted to prove to herself that she could be bold, but the reality had been far more intimidating than the fantasies she had spun in her mind. That night had stayed with her, not because of the physicality, but because of the emotional confusion it had left in its wake. Sean had been a fleeting chapter, yet he had taught her more about herself than she had been ready to learn. She had wanted tenderness, connection, the kind of intimacy that made her feel seen and valued. Instead, she had found something raw and unrefined, something that left her questioning whether she was truly ready for what she thought she wanted. Now, years later, lying beside Roisin, those memories felt like ghosts haunting the edges of her heart. She had spent so much of her life running from that part of herself, the part that had been too curious, too impulsive, too willing to cross lines she didn't fully understand. And yet, in Roisin's presence, something in her stirred again, not the reckless hunger she had felt with Sean, but a quieter, deeper yearning. Roisin shifted beside her, pulling Aisling out of her thoughts. "You're awfully quiet tonight," she said softly, her voice breaking through the haze of memory. "What's going on in that pretty head of yours?" Aisling hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. The memory of Sean felt too raw, too vulnerable to share. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that Roisin might actually understand. "I was just thinking about choices," Aisling said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "About the things we do when we're not sure what we want." Roisin turned to her, propping herself up on one elbow. Her expression was soft, patient. "And did you figure it out? What you want, I mean." Aisling smiled faintly, her fingers brushing over the grass beside her. Not yet. But I think I'm starting to. Roisin chuckled, lying back down and looking up at the stars. Well, take your time. The road's long enough for both of us to figure a few things out. Aisling let out a quiet laugh, grateful for the lightness in Roisin's tone. For all her boldness, Roisin never pushed too hard, never demanded more than Aisling was willing to give. It was a stark contrast to Sean, whose impatience had always made her feel like she was running to keep up. For the first time in a long time, Aisling felt like she could take a breath, like she didn't have to run from her past or rush toward a future she wasn't ready for. She glanced at Roisin, her heart swelling with a tentative hope. Maybe this journey wasn't just about getting to the wedding. Maybe it was about finding the courage to trust again, not just in someone else, but in herself. And maybe, just maybe, Roisin was the person who could help her take that first step. Whiskey and Wildflowers, Chapter 5, The Nightmare. The meadow was quiet, save for the soft rustling of grass in the breeze and the occasional chirp of a bird flitting overhead. Aisling and Roisin had settled into a comfortable silence, lying side by side beneath the expansive sky. The warmth of the sun and the steady rhythm of Roisin's breathing were lulling Aisling into an unexpected sense of ease, a rarity for her. Before she knew it, her eyes grew heavy, and sleep overtook her. But it wasn't peaceful. The dream began innocently enough. She was back in her 20s, at a party where laughter and music filled the air. Sean's face appeared in the crowd, his crooked smile pulling her in like a magnet. The dream shifted, fragmented, and suddenly she was back in that dimly lit room with him, the weight of his hands on her shoulders, the heat of his breath against her neck. Her body tensed as the memory played out, no longer a hazy recollection but vivid, almost real. She saw her younger self pushing his head downward, hoping he'd understand her silent request, only to feel the sharp sting of rejection when he grabbed her hair and twisted her body into submission. She remembered the fear in her chest, the way her heart had raced, not with excitement, but with dread. And then, the way he had finished, abruptly, carelessly, leaving her feeling small, used, and dirty. In the dream, Aisling tried to protest, but no sound came. She felt the weight of shame and disgust wash over her again, the overwhelming need to cleanse herself of his touch, his smell, his presence. She needed a shower, a toothbrush, anything to make her feel like herself again. She woke with a gasp, sitting up so abruptly that Roisin stirred beside her, blinking groggily. Aisling? Roisin's voice was rough with sleep, but her concern was immediate. What's wrong? Aisling pressed a hand to her chest, her breathing uneven as she tried to shake off the remnants of the dream. Her heart pounded, and for a moment, she couldn't find her voice. The meadow around her felt too open, too exposed, and the shame she thought she'd buried years ago came rushing back in a tidal wave. Bad dream, she whispered finally, her voice barely audible. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them as if to shield herself from the memory. Roisin sat up, watching her closely. You looked terrified, she said gently, her tone devoid of the teasing edge she so often carried. Do you want to talk about it? Aisling hesitated. The logical part of her wanted to brush it off, to bury it again and pretend it didn't still haunt her. But another part, the part that had started to trust Roisin, even just a little, wanted to let it out. It was about someone from my past, Aisling said, her words slow and careful. Someone who wasn't kind to me. Roisin's expression softened, her brow furrowing with concern. Was it bad? She asked, her voice quieter now. Aisling nodded, her gaze fixed on the wildflowers swaying in the breeze. I thought I wanted something from him, something exciting, different. But he wasn't gentle. He didn't care what I wanted. Her voice cracked slightly, and she took a shaky breath. I felt so dirty afterward. Like I'd done something wrong, even though I didn't mean to. Roisin reached out, her hand covering Aisling's where it rested on her knee. You didn't do anything wrong, she said firmly, her tone steady. Whatever happened, that's on him, not you. Aisling blinked back tears, biting her lip. Tom, he was my fiancé, he didn't know. I broke things off with him, but I never told him why. I was too ashamed. And I thought, if I told him the truth, he'd think I was broken. You're not broken, Roisin said, squeezing her hand. You've been hurt, yeah, but you're still here, Aisling. And that takes strength. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of Aisling's confession hanging in the air. But instead of feeling judged or pitted, Aisling felt lighter, as if saying the words aloud had loosened their grip on her. Roisin shifted closer, her presence warm and grounding. If you ever want to talk more about it, I'm here, she said softly. But if you just need someone to sit with you, that's okay too. Aisling glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. You're a lot kinder than you let on, you know. Roisin smirked, the mischievous glint returning to her eyes. Don't let it get around. I've got a reputation to uphold. Aisling laughed softly, the tension in her chest easing. She reached for Roisin's hand, gripping it tightly. Thank you. Anytime, Roisin replied, her tone serious despite the playful spark in her gaze. Now, how about we find something to get your mind off things? I saw a pub a few miles back. Could be a good spot for a bit of music and distraction. Aisling nodded, feeling a flicker of hope stir within her. Maybe she wasn't ready to forget the past, but with Roisin by her side, she was starting to believe she could face it. Whiskey and Wildflowers, Chapter 6, The Pub and the Piano. The small pub Roisin had spotted earlier was nestled on the edge of a village that seemed almost forgotten by time. Its weathered sign creaked gently in the breeze, and the glow from the windows spilled onto the cobbled street, warm and inviting. The soft murmur of conversation and occasional bursts of laughter reached them as they approached. Roisin pushed open the heavy wooden door, gesturing for Aisling to enter. After you, milady. Aisling rolled her eyes, but the corners of her mouth lifted in a smile. The dream still lingered in the back of her mind, but Roisin's presence had a way of anchoring her, pulling her back to the present. Inside, the pub was cozy, with low wooden beams and a roaring fire in the hearth. Locals sat in clusters at worn tables, their laughter mingling with the faint strains of a piano being played in the corner. Aisling scanned the room, her eyes landing on the source of the music, a young woman, no older than 20, playing a jaunty tune that had a few patrons tapping their feet. Now this, Roisin said, her voice filled with approval, is the kind of place I like. They found a small table near the fire, and Roisin ordered a whiskey for herself and a cider for Aisling. When the drinks arrived, she held up her glass. To escaping bad dreams and making better memories. Aisling hesitated, then lifted her glass, clinking it gently against Roisin's. To that. For a while, they sat in companionable silence, watching the room come alive with music and laughter. Roisin leaned back in her chair, her eyes twinkling as she took in the scene. You know, she said after a moment, this place reminds me of one my granddad used to take me to when I was a kid. He'd play the fiddle, and everyone in the pub would sing along. I always thought it was magic. Aisling tilted her head, surprised. You never told me you played the fiddle. I don't, Roisin admitted with a laugh. I tried once. It was a disaster. Granddad said I had a musician's soul but a farmer's hands. Aisling laughed, the sound light and genuine. Well, you seem to do just fine with the guitar. Roisin shrugged, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. Guitar's different. It's like an old friend. You don't have to be perfect, you just have to mean it. Aisling nodded, her gaze softening. I like that. The piano music shifted then, the jaunty tune giving way to something slower, more soulful. Roisin's eyes lit up, and she leaned forward. Dance with me. Aisling blinked, startled. What? No. Why not? Roisin asked, her grin widening. It's just us and a bunch of strangers we'll never see again. Come on. I don't dance, Aisling said firmly, though the faint blush creeping up her cheeks betrayed her embarrassment. Roisin stood, holding out her hand. There's a first time for everything. Aisling hesitated, glancing around the room. No one seemed to be paying them much attention, and the soft, lilting melody from the piano was oddly inviting. With a resigned sigh, she took Roisin's hand and allowed herself to be led to the open space near the hearth. Roisin placed one hand on Aisling's waist, holding her other hand gently. See? Not so hard. You're going to regret this, Aisling muttered, but there was a hint of a smile on her lips. Roisin grinned. I'll take my chances. They moved slowly, swaying to the music, and Aisling found herself relaxing as the warmth of Roisin's touch and the steadiness of her gaze melted away her self-consciousness. For the first time in a long time, Aisling felt free. As the song came to an end, Roisin dipped her dramatically, drawing a surprised laugh from Aisling that echoed through the pub. When they returned to their table, breathless and grinning, Aisling shook her head. You're impossible. And yet, here you are, Roisin replied, her voice soft but filled with meaning. Aisling met her gaze, her smile fading into something quieter. Here I am. They sat in silence for a moment, the unspoken connection between them growing stronger. Aisling reached for her cider, her fingers brushing against Roisin's as she did. Neither of them pulled away. Thank you, Aisling said softly. For everything tonight. Roisin tilted her head, her smile gentle. Anytime, love. As the night wore on and the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Aisling found herself daring to believe that maybe, just maybe, this journey was leading her somewhere worth staying. Light conflict ideas. Clash of independence versus control. Conflict. Roisin's free-spirited nature and tendency to make spur-of-the-moment decisions clash with Aisling's preference for structure and planning. Example, Roisin decides to take a scenic detour without consulting Aisling, causing them to get lost. Aisling feels frustrated, interpreting the decision as careless, while Roisin views it as an adventure. Resolution. Through playful banter and a shared effort to find their way, they come to appreciate each other's differing approaches to life. A figure from the past. Conflict. They encounter someone from one of their pasts, e.g., Tom, Aisling's ex-fiancé, or an old friend of Roisin's. This sparks insecurity and raises questions about whether either of them is truly ready to let go of their past. Example, Tom unexpectedly crosses paths with them in a nearby town and casually mentions his upcoming wedding, forcing Aisling to confront lingering guilt while Roisin feels left out of the conversation. Resolution. Aisling reassures Roisin that she's moving forward, and Roisin helps Aisling laugh off her lingering doubts. Miscommunication and assumptions. Conflict. Aisling interprets one of Roisin's playful remarks as a jab at her reserved nature, while Roisin feels misunderstood when Aisling reacts coldly. Example, Roisin jokes about Aisling being too proper to join her in a spur-of-the-moment pub song, and Aisling takes it personally, seeing it as a dismissal of her efforts to loosen up. Resolution. They talk it out during a quiet moment, with Roisin apologizing for overstepping and Aisling admitting her insecurities. Financial disparity. Conflict. Roisin's carefree attitude toward money and Aisling's frugality come to a head when Roisin impulsively spends on something unnecessary, e.g., a pricey bottle of wine or a souvenir. Aisling feels this is impractical, while Roisin feels judged. Example, Roisin insists on treating Aisling to a lavish meal, which makes Aisling feel uncomfortable about not being able to reciprocate. Resolution. They find common ground, with Roisin explaining her desire to share experiences and Aisling acknowledging her need to loosen her grip on control. A small jealousy. Conflict. Aisling notices a barmaid or pub patron flirting with Roisin, triggering feelings of inadequacy. Roisin, meanwhile, enjoys the attention but doesn't notice how it affects Aisling. Example, the barmaid leans over their table with an easy familiarity that Aisling can't quite match, leaving her quiet and withdrawn for the rest of the night. Resolution. Roisin notices Aisling's discomfort and makes it clear that she's not interested in anyone but her. Whiskey and wildflowers. Scene example, miscommunication. Aisling watched as Roisin leaned over the bar, chatting easily with the bartender. The man, a tall, broad-shouldered sort with a thick accent, laughed at something Roisin said, leaning in slightly as if drawn to her magnetic charm. Aisling sipped her cider, her smile fading. When Roisin returned to their table, she noticed the shift in Aisling's mood. "What's with the long face?" she asked, sliding into her chair. "Nothing," Aisling replied, though her tone was clipped. Roisin tilted her head, her brow furrowing. "All right, out with it. Did I do something?" Aisling hesitated, then blurted out, "You were flirting." Roisin blinked, then laughed, a quick, surprised sound. "Flirting? With who?" "With the bartender," Aisling said, crossing her arms. It was obvious. Roisin's expression softened, the laughter fading. "Oh, Aisling, that wasn't flirting. I was just being friendly. He gave us an extra drink on the house." Aisling's cheeks flushed, and she looked away. I don't know. I felt out of place. Like I couldn't keep up with you." Roisin reached across the table, taking Aisling's hand. "Hey, I'm here with you. Not him. Not anyone else. You." Aisling's gaze returned to Roisin, her defenses crumbling under the warmth in her eyes. "I'm sorry. I guess I overreacted." Roisin squeezed her hand, a smile tugging at her lips. "No harm done. But next time, just tell me, all right? I don't want you feeling like you're not enough, because you are." The tension between them eased, replaced by a quiet understanding. And as the night continued, Aisling found herself relaxing again, grateful for Roisin's patience and her unwavering focus on building something real. Whiskey and Wildflowers, Chapter 7, A Strange Feeling. Aisling sat at their table, her hands wrapped tightly around her cider glass. The noise of the pub seemed louder now, the cheerful laughter and the lilting tune from the piano grating against her nerves. Across the room, Roisin was leaning on the bar, chatting easily with the bartender. Her hat was tipped back, her red hair catching the warm glow of the firelight. She tossed her head back and laughed at something he said, and Aisling's stomach twisted. She didn't understand the feeling, this heavy knot deep in her gut, coiling tighter with every second Roisin stayed at the bar. It wasn't anger, not exactly, but something close. Something sharper. She tried to brush it off, telling herself it was ridiculous to feel this way. After all, Roisin was just being her usual charming self. That's who she was, warm, magnetic, and easy to like. So why did it feel like Aisling was about to come apart? When Roisin finally returned to the table, holding 2 glasses of whiskey, she slid one toward Aisling with a grin. "Compliments of our friend at the bar. Turns out he's a fan of women who can hold their liquor." Aisling forced a tight smile, taking the glass. "Lucky you." Roisin frowned, setting her own glass down. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," Aisling said quickly, but her voice was clipped. She looked down, tracing the rim of her cider glass with her finger. Roisin tilted her head, studying her. "Aisling, what's wrong? You've been quiet since I came back." Aisling sighed, frustrated with herself. She didn't even know how to put it into words. How could she? How could she explain this strange, gnawing feeling in her chest when she didn't fully understand it herself? "It's nothing," she said again, but the strain in her voice betrayed her. Roisin leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. "Come on, love. Out with it. You don't get to mope and then pretend everything's fine." Aisling bristled at the word mope, heat rising in her cheeks. "I'm not moping." Roisin raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "All right, then. What's bothering you?" Aisling hesitated, the words catching in her throat. She wanted to tell Roisin to stop pushing, to let it go, but at the same time, she hated the idea of leaving this unspoken. She hated the idea of Roisin not knowing what she was feeling, even if she didn't fully understand it herself. She began, faltering. She glanced at the bar, then back at Roisin, who was watching her intently. I didn't like the way you were flirting with him. Roisin blinked, surprised. The bartender? Aisling, I wasn't flirting. Well, it looked like flirting to me, Aisling said, her voice sharper than she intended. You were laughing, leaning in. It was like I wasn't even here. Roisin's expression softened, and she reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on Aisling's. Hey, I wasn't trying to ignore you. I thought you'd like some space earlier. Aisling looked away, guilt creeping in. I don't know why I'm even saying this, she admitted. I'm not. She trailed off, the words tangling in her mind. Roisin tilted her head, her voice gentle. You're not what? I'm not a lesbian, Aisling blurted, her face burning. Or anything like that. I've never felt this way about a woman before. But when you were talking to him, she paused, struggling to find the right words. I didn't like it. I didn't like you paying attention to someone else. For a moment, Roisin didn't respond. Then, she smiled, squeezing Aisling's hand. You don't have to label it, you know. Whatever this is, it's just us. And for what it's worth, I haven't felt this way about anyone in a long time. Aisling looked at her, surprised. You haven't? Roisin shook her head, her gaze steady. No. And definitely not about any bartender. I can promise you that. Aisling's lips quirked into a small, tentative smile. The knot in her stomach began to loosen, replaced by a warmth she couldn't quite explain. She still didn't fully understand what she was feeling, what this connection with Roisin meant, but for the first time, she felt like she didn't have to figure it out all at once. Okay, she said softly, her fingers curling around Roisin's. Okay. Roisin grinned, lifting her whiskey glass. To not needing all the answers. Aisling laughed, clinking her glass against Roisin's. To that. As they sipped their drinks, the tension between them eased, replaced by a quiet understanding. Aisling still had questions, doubts, and fears, but for now, she let herself enjoy the moment, the way Roisin's smile lit up the room, the warmth of her hand in hers, and the spark of something new and beautiful unfolding between them. Whiskey and Wildflowers, Chapter 8, In the Rain. I don't know how to read you, Aisling said, her voice trembling as she finally let the words out. As soon as the sentence escaped her lips, a wave of panic surged through her. The vulnerability of her admission felt like a free fall, and the thought of misreading Roisin, of laying her heart bare and facing rejection, was unbearable. The memory of Sean, of his cold dismissal, clawed at the edges of her mind, pulling her back into that spiral of shame and self-doubt. She couldn't do it. Not again. Not tonight. Without waiting for Roisin's response, Aisling stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as she bolted for the door. Aisling, wait. Roisin called after her, but Aisling didn't stop. The noise of the pub faded behind her as she pushed her way outside, the cool night air hitting her like a slap. She barely noticed the rain at first. It came in light, misty drops, quickly giving way to a torrential downpour. Within seconds, her hair was plastered to her face, and her dress clung to her body like a second skin. She stumbled to the car, fumbling for the door handle, only to find it locked. Her bag with the keys was back inside the pub. Oh, for God's sake, she muttered, leaning against the car and hugging her arms around herself. The rain soaked through her layers, chilling her to the bone. Her makeup streaked down her cheeks, mixing with the rainwater, and she felt utterly exposed, cold, wet, and alone. What am I doing? She whispered to herself, her breath visible in the damp, chilly air. Oh, how could I have fallen for a woman? She shook her head, tears mingling with the rain. This wasn't her. This wasn't who she was supposed to be. She was a good Catholic girl, wasn't she? Someone who made safe choices, predictable choices. Someone who didn't stray from the path she'd been taught to follow. But then why did the thought of Roisin fill her with such warmth, such longing? Why did the idea of being with her feel like stepping into sunlight after years of shadows? The rain fell harder, the icy droplets slicing through her confusion and leaving her shivering. She pressed her forehead against the car window, her teeth chattering as she hugged herself tighter. Aisling. The voice was soft but steady, cutting through the storm. She turned, startled, to see Roisin emerging from the darkness, her red hair darkened by the rain and her hat nowhere to be seen. She was drenched, her shirt clinging to her frame, but her expression was calm, unwavering. Roisin stopped a few feet away, her eyes searching Aisling's face. Then, without hesitation, she stepped closer, slipping her arms around her and pulling her into a firm, warm embrace. "Why did you run?" Roisin asked quietly, her voice steady despite the rain. Aisling couldn't find the words. She shook her head, burying her face in Roisin's shoulder as the tears came harder, mingling with the rain soaking them both. Roisin held her tightly, one hand stroking her back in slow, soothing circles. "Hey," she murmured, her breath warm against Aisling's ear. "It's okay. Whatever you're feeling, it's okay." Aisling sniffled, pulling back just enough to look at her. Roisin's hands moved to her face, brushing the wet strands of hair away from her cheeks. Her gaze was steady, her green eyes glowing softly in the dim light. She studied Aisling for a moment, her expression unreadable, before speaking again. "I want to be with you tonight," Roisin said, her voice low and certain. "Only you." Aisling froze, her breath catching. The sincerity in Roisin's voice was undeniable, and the intensity of her gaze made her heart ache. She searched Roisin's face for any trace of doubt, any hint that this was just a fleeting moment of kindness or pity. But there was none. "Hi," Aisling began, but the words caught in her throat. "You don't have to say anything," Roisin said softly. "But don't run from this. From us. Not if you feel it too." Aisling's hands trembled as she reached up, brushing her fingers against Roisin's cheek. The rain dripped from their hair, their faces, but neither of them seemed to notice anymore. Slowly, tentatively, Aisling leaned in, her lips brushing against Roisin's in a kiss that was hesitant at first, then deeper, warmer, and filled with all the unspoken emotions she hadn't been able to put into words. When they finally pulled apart, Aisling felt a strange mixture of relief and exhilaration. The cold, the rain, the doubts, they were still there, but they no longer felt insurmountable. Roisin smiled at her, her hand still resting on her cheek. "Come on," she said gently. "Let's get you inside before you freeze." Aisling nodded, her chest tight with a feeling she hadn't dared to name until now. As Roisin led her back toward the pub, her arm wrapped securely around her shoulders, Aisling allowed herself to hope, for the first time, that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something she didn't have to run from. Whiskey and Wildflowers, Chapter 9, The Bed and Breakfast. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time they spotted the small, weathered sign glowing faintly in the night, "Vacancy, the Wren's Nest B&B." The house was quaint and inviting, its shutters freshly painted a soft blue and a narrow path of cobblestones leading to the front door. Lights glowed warmly from within, spilling onto the small garden out front where lavender bushes swayed in the breeze. Roisin turned the car off and leaned back in her seat, glancing over at Aisling. She was staring out the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her damp hair curling around her face. She hadn't said much since they'd gotten back in the car. "Looks cozy," Roisin said, her tone light as she nodded toward the house. "Better than sleeping in here, anyway." Aisling nodded absently, not meeting her gaze. Roisin sighed and reached over, giving her hand a quick squeeze. "Come on, let's get you inside." The bell above the door jingled as they stepped into the foyer, the air immediately warmer and filled with the faint scent of lemon polish and baked bread. A kind-faced older woman greeted them from behind the small desk, her glasses perched on the tip of her nose. "Just the two of you, then?" she asked with a smile. Roisin nodded. "That's right." The woman handed over a key attached to a brass fob. "Room 6, up the stairs." Breakfast is at 7 sharp, and there's a kettle in your room if you need tea before then. Roisin thanked her and led Aisling up the narrow staircase, the old wood creaking beneath their feet. Room 6 was small but charming, with floral wallpaper, a soft quilt on the double bed, and a single armchair tucked beneath the window. A lamp cast a warm glow over the room, and the faint hum of the rain against the roof was the only sound. Roisin closed the door behind them, setting the key on the small nightstand. She turned to Aisling, who stood near the bed, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "You should take a shower," Roisin said gently, walking over and brushing a damp strand of hair from Aisling's cheek. "Warm up, get out of these wet clothes. We'll talk when you're done." Aisling hesitated, her eyes searching Roisin's face as if looking for reassurance. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to say anything right now," Roisin replied, her tone soft but firm. "Just take care of yourself first, okay?" Aisling nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. She grabbed her bag and disappeared into the small ensuite bathroom, closing the door behind her. In the shower, the hot water hit Aisling's skin, and she let out a shaky breath as the warmth began to seep into her chilled bones. She leaned against the tiled wall, closing her eyes as the steam rose around her. Her thoughts swirled like the water circling the drain. Roisin's touch, her words, her unwavering gaze in the rain. Aisling ran her hands through her wet hair, letting the water rinse away the remnants of her makeup and the tension in her body. She felt raw, exposed, not just from the rain, but from everything that had happened tonight. The jealousy, the fear, the longing. She had never felt like this before, and it terrified her. And yet, beneath the fear, there was something else, a flicker of hope, small but persistent. Roisin hadn't run. She hadn't dismissed her or laughed at her feelings. She had stayed, holding her in the rain, offering comfort without judgment. As the water began to cool, Aisling turned off the shower and stepped out, wrapping herself in one of the soft towels hanging by the sink. She dried off quickly and slipped into a pair of loose pajamas, her damp hair curling around her shoulders. She caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror, her cheeks pink from the heat of the water, her eyes wide and searching. Taking a deep breath, she opened the bathroom door and stepped back into the room. The conversation. Roisin was sitting on the edge of the bed, her long legs stretched out and her hands resting loosely in her lap. She looked up as Aisling entered, her expression softening. "Feel better?" she asked. Aisling nodded, her fingers twisting nervously in the hem of her shirt. "Yeah, thanks." Roisin patted the space beside her, and Aisling hesitated before sitting down, the mattress dipping slightly beneath her weight. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet hum of the rain filling the space between them. "I'm sorry," Aisling said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "For running out like that. I got scared." Roisin turned to her, her brow furrowed with concern. "Scared of what?" "Of this," Aisling admitted, gesturing vaguely between them. "Of how I feel. I don't know how to." "I'm not," she trailed off, her cheeks burning. Roisin reached over, taking her hand gently. "Aisling," she said softly, "you don't have to explain it. I know this is new for you, and I know it's scary. But you don't have to figure it all out right now." Aisling looked at her, her eyes filling with tears. "What if I mess this up? What if I ruin it before it even starts?" "You won't," Roisin said firmly, her thumb brushing lightly over the back of Aisling's hand. "And even if you do, we'll figure it out together." Aisling let out a shaky laugh, wiping at her eyes. "You make it sound so simple." Roisin smiled, leaning in slightly. "It doesn't have to be complicated. Just take it one step at a time. And for tonight, let's just be here. Together." Aisling nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and gratitude. She leaned into Roisin's side, letting her head rest on her shoulder as the storm outside softened to a gentle patter. For the first time in a long time, she felt warm, truly warm, not just on the outside, but deep in her heart. Whiskey and Wildflowers, Chapter 10, The Song in the Shower. After a few quiet moments of sitting together, Roisin stood, stretching her arms above her head. "All right," she said with a grin, "your turn to sit tight while I clean up. I feel like a drowned cat." Aisling smiled faintly, her cheeks still pink from the warmth of their earlier conversation. She watched as Roisin grabbed her bag and disappeared into the bathroom, the sound of running water soon filling the small room. For the first few moments, Aisling stared absently at the quilt on the bed, her fingers running over its soft, worn edges. But then, faintly, she heard it, a voice, rich and lilting, rising and falling in the unmistakable cadence of an Irish brogue. Roisin was singing. The song was haunting and beautiful, the melody weaving its way through the door and wrapping around Aisling like a warm embrace. She recognized it, a Clannad tune her mother used to play when she was a child. The words spoke of love and longing, of moments stolen and cherished. Aisling's heart tightened in her chest. The sound of Roisin's voice, unguarded and vulnerable, drew her like a moth to a flame. Before she realized what she was doing, she was on her feet, moving toward the bathroom door. Her fingers trembled as she turned the knob and stepped inside. The room was filled with steam, the air warm and thick, and Roisin's voice grew clearer. Aisling's gaze drifted to the shower, where the outline of Roisin's figure was visible through the frosted curtain. Her red hair, darkened by the water, clung to her shoulders, and her voice faltered slightly as she caught sight of Aisling's shadow in the doorway. "Aisling?" Roisin called, her voice tinged with surprise. Aisling didn't answer. Her breath came in shallow, uneven bursts as she reached for the hem of her shirt, pulling it over her head. Her pants followed, then her underwear, until she stood bare in the steam-filled room. Her heart raced, her pulse thrumming in her ears as she crossed the small space to the shower. Roisin's singing stopped abruptly as the shower curtain was pulled back. Her green eyes widened as Aisling stepped in, her damp hair curling around her shoulders, her skin flushed from the warmth of the room. "Aisling," Roisin began, her voice uncertain. "What are you?" Aisling didn't let her finish. She reached up, her fingers brushing gently against Roisin's cheek, her gaze searching hers. "I don't want to be scared anymore," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I don't want to keep running from this. From you." Roisin's breath hitched, her hands hovering uncertainly before settling on Aisling's waist. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the sound of the water cascading around them the only noise. Then, slowly, Roisin leaned in, her lips brushing against Aisling's in a kiss that was tender and hesitant, as though she were afraid of breaking the moment. Aisling melted into the kiss, her hands sliding into Roisin's wet hair. The warmth of the water and the softness of Roisin's lips sent a shiver through her, one that had nothing to do with the cold. This kiss wasn't like anything she'd experienced before, it wasn't hurried or demanding. It was careful, unspoken emotions pouring out with every touch. When they finally pulled apart, Roisin rested her forehead against Aisling's, her breath coming in soft, uneven bursts. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly, her hands still resting lightly on Aisling's waist. Aisling nodded, her eyes shining. "I've never been more sure of anything." Roisin smiled, her lips brushing against Aisling's once more, this time with more certainty. As the water continued to fall around them, they stood together, their fears and doubts melting away in the warmth of the moment. Whiskey and Wildflowers, Chapter 11, The Storm. The water had cooled, and the air was thick with steam as Roisin turned off the shower. She reached for the nearest towel, wrapping it around Aisling first before grabbing one for herself. The two women stood close, their skin glistening and flushed from the heat. Roisin leaned down slightly, her hand brushing a damp strand of hair from Aisling's face. "You all right?" she asked softly. Aisling nodded, though her cheeks were still pink, her heart still racing. "I think so." Roisin smiled gently. "Good. Let's get you warmed up properly." They stepped out of the bathroom together, leaving the lingering warmth of the steam for the cooler air of the bedroom. Roisin lit the small lamp by the bed, its soft glow casting a warm light over the floral wallpaper and wooden furniture. But outside, the storm was gathering strength. The rain lashed against the windows, and a low rumble of thunder rolled in the distance. Aisling paused, wrapping the towel tightly around her as the first flash of lightning lit up the room. When the thunder came, loud and sudden, she jumped, her breath catching in her throat. Roisin turned to her immediately, concern flickering in her green eyes. "Hey, it's all right," she said, stepping closer and resting her hands lightly on Aisling's shoulders. "It's just a storm." "I know," Aisling murmured, her voice barely audible. I've never liked thunder. It makes me feel so exposed." Another crash of thunder followed, and Aisling flinched again. Without thinking, she moved closer to Roisin, her towel slipping slightly as she sought the comfort of her warmth. Roisin didn't hesitate. She pulled Aisling into her arms, holding her tightly. "You're not alone," she murmured, her voice steady and reassuring. "Not tonight. Not ever if I can help it." Aisling buried her face against Roisin's shoulder, her body trembling slightly. "How do you do that?" she asked, her voice muffled. "How do you stay so calm?" Roisin chuckled softly, her hand tracing soothing circles on Aisling's back. "Years of practice, love. But even if I wasn't, I think being here with you makes it easier." Aisling pulled back slightly, her eyes searching Roisin's face. "You mean that?" Roisin nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I do." The room lit up again as another flash of lightning streaked across the sky, and the thunder that followed was deafening. Aisling jumped again, but this time, Roisin was ready. She cupped Aisling's face gently, her thumbs brushing against her cheeks. "Hey," she said softly. "Focus on me. Just me." Aisling's breathing slowed as she met Roisin's gaze. The fear that had knotted in her chest began to loosen, replaced by a warmth that spread through her like a quiet flame. "We're here," Roisin said, her voice low and steady. "Together. Naked, vulnerable. But together, we're strong. Nothing out there can touch us, all right?" Aisling nodded slowly, her hands gripping Roisin's arms for support. "All right," she whispered. Roisin leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to Aisling's forehead. Then, with a gentle smile, she guided her to the bed, pulling back the quilt and settling them both beneath its warmth. The storm raged outside, the thunder and lightning relentless, but within the small room, there was a cocoon of safety, a quiet refuge that they had built together. Aisling rested her head against Roisin's chest, the steady rhythm of her heartbeat calming her nerves. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging. The storm outside no longer felt so threatening, not with Roisin's arms wrapped around her. As her eyelids grew heavy, Aisling whispered, "Thank you." Roisin smiled, her fingers brushing lightly through Aisling's damp hair. "For what?" "For being here. For not letting me run away." Roisin pressed a kiss to the top of her head, her voice a quiet murmur. "Always, love. Always." And as the storm raged on, they held each other close, their vulnerabilities no longer something to fear, but something to share, knowing that together, they could weather anything. Whiskey and Wildflowers, Chapter 12, Morning Light. The sun crept into the room, its golden rays painting the floral wallpaper in soft, warm hues. Roisin stirred, her body heavy with the lingering pull of sleep. As she opened her eyes, the gentle hum of birdsong filled the air, blending with the faint rustle of leaves outside the window. She blinked, her gaze drifting to Aisling, who was still fast asleep beside her. The blanket had slipped down during the night, pulling around Aisling's waist and leaving her upper body bare. Her chest rose and fell with each steady breath, her fair skin glowing softly in the morning light. Roisin's breath hitched as her eyes lingered, a warmth blooming in her chest. Aisling looked so peaceful, her lips slightly parted, her damp curls framing her face like a halo. But it was more than that. There was something about her, something quietly magnetic, that left Roisin feeling both awed and vulnerable. Her gaze flicked down, taking in the soft curve of Aisling's chest. Roisin felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name, admiration, perhaps, tinged with a small, nagging jealousy. She was never one to dwell on her own body, but compared to Aisling, she felt lacking. Aisling's softness, her curves, were a stark contrast to Roisin's lean frame, her barely there chest. She sighed quietly, shaking her head. Don't be ridiculous, she thought. She's here, isn't she? She's with you. But the thought didn't stop her from reaching out, her fingers hovering just above Aisling's skin. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. What if Aisling woke up? What if she pulled away, startled or unsure? The memory of her confession from the night before, her fears and doubts, resurfaced in Roisin's mind. And yet, the moment felt too perfect to let pass. The sunlight, the quiet intimacy of the morning, the steady rhythm of Aisling's breathing, it all called to her, urged her to close the distance. Slowly, carefully, Roisin let her fingertips brush against Aisling's shoulder. Her skin was warm, impossibly soft, and the touch sent a shiver through Roisin's hand. She traced a light path down to Aisling's collarbone, her movements tentative, almost reverent. Aisling stirred slightly, her breathing hitching for a moment before settling again. Roisin froze, her heart in her throat. But when Aisling didn't wake, she let out a soft sigh of relief. Her hand moved lower, skimming over the gentle curve of Aisling's chest. The touch was featherlight, almost hesitant, as though she were afraid of breaking the spell. Her fingers brushed against the edge of Aisling's breast, and the warmth that spread through her was equal parts longing and tenderness. Aisling, she whispered, her voice barely audible as though testing the waters. Aisling's eyes fluttered open, hazy with sleep. She blinked up at Roisin, her brow furrowing slightly as she processed the moment. Roisin, she murmured, her voice soft and groggy. Roisin pulled her hand back quickly, her cheeks flushing. Sorry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to. I just... Aisling propped herself up on one elbow, the blanket slipping further as she looked at Roisin. Her eyes were still heavy with sleep, but there was no anger or confusion in her gaze, only quiet curiosity. You don't have to apologize, Aisling said softly, her lips curving into a small, shy smile. I'm just surprised. Roisin let out a nervous laugh, running a hand through her tousled hair. I wasn't sure if you'd be okay with it. I didn't want to overstep. Aisling reached out, her fingers brushing against Roisin's cheek. You didn't. The words hung between them, soft and unspoken, as Aisling leaned in, her lips brushing against Roisin's in a kiss that was slow and tender. The hesitation of the night before was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty that made Roisin's heart ache in the best possible way. When they pulled apart, Aisling rested her forehead against Roisin's, her breath warm against her skin. I'm glad you took the chance, she whispered. Roisin smiled, her hands settling on Aisling's waist as she pulled her closer. Me too. As the sunlight streamed into the room, bathing them in its golden glow, the storm outside seemed like a distant memory. In this moment, there was only warmth, only connection, only the quiet, unspoken promise of something new and beautiful unfolding between them. Whiskey and Wildflowers, Chapter 13, The Call. The soft hum of the morning was broken by the sharp trill of Roisin's phone vibrating on the nightstand. She groaned softly, reaching over Aisling to grab it, careful not to jostle her too much. The screen lit up with Maeve's name, the words, incoming call, flashing insistently. It's Maeve, Roisin murmured, glancing at Aisling with an apologetic smile. Sorry, I need to take this. Aisling nodded, brushing a hand through her damp curls as she pulled the blanket up to cover herself. Go ahead. Roisin swiped to answer and pressed the phone to her ear. Maeve, she said, her voice still heavy with sleep. You're up early. You mean you're up late? Maeve teased, her voice bright and bubbly. I was starting to think you'd gotten lost on the way. Are you okay? Where are you? Roisin hesitated, glancing over at Aisling, who was watching her with quiet curiosity. She scratched the back of her head, buying a moment to think. We're fine. Just stopped overnight at a B&B. Needed a break from all the driving. We? Maeve asked, her tone instantly curious. Who's we? You didn't mention bringing anyone. Roisin froze, her gaze flicking back to Aisling, who raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. She bit her lip, trying to decide how much to say. It wasn't that Maeve wouldn't understand. Her cousin had always been open-minded and supportive, but Roisin wasn't sure she could explain everything just yet. Not when she herself was still figuring it out. I ran into someone, Roisin said finally, her words careful. A friend. We decided to drive together. A friend? Maeve repeated, her voice dripping with intrigue. Roisin, don't you dare hold out on me. Who is it? Someone I know. Maybe, Roisin said vaguely, rubbing the bridge of her nose. It's complicated, Maeve. Can we not do this right now? Maeve let out a dramatic sigh. Fine. But you'd better tell me everything when you get here. I mean it, Roisin. Roisin laughed softly, the sound tinged with relief. All right, you win. I'll tell you everything. Eventually. Good, Maeve said firmly. And don't be late, okay? The rehearsal dinner is tomorrow, and I need you here. We'll be there, Roisin promised. Whiskey and Wildflowers, Chapter 14, Shared Histories. As Roisin ended the call and placed the phone back on the nightstand, Aisling sat up straighter, her expression thoughtful. You know, she said, tucking her legs beneath her, I've known Maeve for years. We were friends back in boarding school. Roisin turned to her, surprised. Wait, really? She never mentioned that. Aisling laughed softly, shrugging. It's been a while. We lost touch after school, but for a time, we were inseparable. She was, well, exactly the same as she is now, full of life, always the center of attention. That does sound like Maeve, Roisin said with a grin, sitting back on the bed. So why didn't you mention it before? I wasn't sure if she'd remember me, Aisling admitted, twisting a strand of her hair nervously. It's been so long. And besides, she hesitated, glancing down at her hands. I wasn't sure how to explain why I was here. With you. Roisin frowned slightly, her voice softening. You don't have to explain anything, you know. Not to her, not to anyone. Aisling looked up at her, her gaze steady. Maybe not. But Maeve and I used to talk about everything, our dreams, our fears, the kind of lives we wanted. If she remembers me, I don't want her to think I'm hiding from her. Roisin nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She'll remember you, Aisling. You're not the kind of person anyone forgets. Aisling blushed, her heart fluttering at Roisin's words. You think so? I know so, Roisin said, leaning in to kiss her gently. And when Maeve starts asking all her questions, we'll figure it out. Together. The two of them shared a quiet moment, their foreheads resting against each other as the sunlight streamed into the room. Whatever lay ahead, whether it was Maeve's curiosity or the unknowns of their growing connection, they were ready to face it. Together. Whiskey and Wildflowers, Chapter 15, The Final Stop. The sprawling countryside gave way to a charming hotel nestled on the edge of a small, picturesque village. Its ivy-covered stone facade and flower-filled balconies exuded warmth, the kind of place designed to host weddings and celebrations. Roisin parked the car, letting out a long sigh as she turned off the engine. Well, we made it, she said with a grin, glancing at Aisling. No major disasters. Speak for yourself, Aisling replied, her lips curving into a smile. My nerves are still recovering from your detour through that sheep pasture. Hey, Roisin said, raising a hand in mock defense. I got us here, didn't I? They both laughed, the sound carrying easily between them, and for a moment, the world felt light and uncomplicated. Aisling reached for the door handle, but paused when Roisin placed a hand on her arm. "Ready for this?" Roisin asked, her green eyes soft with concern. Aisling nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "As long as you're with me." They stepped out of the car and grabbed their bags, the sounds of laughter and faint music floating through the air. The hotel lobby was bustling with activity, and it didn't take long for Maeve to spot them from across the room. "Roisin," Maeve called, her bright voice cutting through the chatter. She hurried over, her arms outstretched, and pulled her cousin into a tight hug. "I thought you'd never get here." "Sorry," Roisin said with a laugh, returning the embrace. "Had to make a few stops along the way." Maeve turned to Aisling, her eyes widening in surprise. "Aisling? Is that really you?" Aisling smiled, her cheeks pink. "It's me." Maeve pulled her into an equally enthusiastic hug, laughing with delight. "I can't believe this!" "What are the odds? You two traveling together. How did this happen?" "It's a long story," Aisling said, glancing at Roisin with a small, shy smile. "But it's been an adventure." Maeve raised an eyebrow, her gaze flicking between them. "Oh, I bet it has." Her tone was playful, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes as she noticed the way Roisin's hand lingered lightly on Aisling's back. Settling in. Their room was cozy and elegant, with a single large bed draped in crisp white linens and a view of the garden below. Aisling set her bag down by the armchair, glancing around nervously. "Are you sure this isn't going to be awkward? Sharing a room, I mean." Roisin smirked, flopping onto the bed and stretching out. "We've shared a lot more than this room in the past few days, love. I think we'll survive." Aisling rolled her eyes, but couldn't help smiling. "You're impossible." "And you love it," Roisin replied, winking. Reunion dinner. The rehearsal dinner was held in the hotel's grand dining hall, its high ceilings draped with fairy lights and fresh flowers adorning every table. Maeve kept glancing at Roisin and Aisling throughout the meal, her curiosity clearly growing. When dessert was served, Maeve leaned over, resting her chin in her hand as she grinned at the pair of them. "All right, spill," she said. "What's going on between you two?" Roisin raised an eyebrow, playing innocent. "What do you mean?" "Oh, don't give me that," Maeve said, laughing. "I saw the way you two were looking at each other earlier. And the giggling. You're like a couple of schoolgirls." Aisling's cheeks turned bright red, and she glanced down at her hands, but Roisin just grinned, leaning back in her chair. "Maybe we've had a bit of fun along the way." "Fun," Maeve repeated, her gaze narrowing playfully. "Roisin O'Malley, I know that look." "That's not fun. That's something much bigger." Aisling looked up then, her heart racing, but Maeve's expression wasn't teasing anymore. It was kind, thoughtful. "You two have something special, don't you?" she said softly. Roisin glanced at Aisling, her grin softening into a smile. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I think we do." Aisling's chest tightened, her nervousness giving way to a warm, overwhelming sense of relief. She smiled shyly, meeting Maeve's gaze. "It's new, but it feels right." Maeve beamed, reaching across the table to squeeze Aisling's hand. "I'm so happy for you. Both of you. Love's a rare thing, you know. When you find it, you have to hold on to it." Roisin grinned, raising her glass. "To holding on, then." Maeve and Aisling clinked their glasses against hers, their laughter blending with the sounds of celebration around them. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Aisling let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something truly beautiful. Whiskey and Wildflowers, Chapter 16, The Wedding. The church bells rang out, their peals echoing through the crisp morning air. Guests filtered into the small countryside chapel, the soft murmur of conversation filling the space. Roisin and Aisling stood near the back, watching as Maeve, radiant in her ecru wedding gown, floated down the aisle on her father's arm. "She looks beautiful," Aisling whispered, her voice tinged with awe. Roisin nodded, her eyes fixed on Maeve, but her thoughts elsewhere. It wasn't Maeve she was seeing in her mind's eye, it was Aisling. She could picture her in white, her golden hair swept up in soft curls, her face glowing with joy. The thought made Roisin's heart ache in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Was it just the romance of the day, the heady mix of flowers, vows, and love songs? Or was it something deeper, something she had been feeling for days but hadn't dared to name? The reception. The reception was held in a grand marquee on the hotel grounds, the tables adorned with fresh blooms and the air filled with the cheerful hum of celebration. Roisin and Aisling sat together, their chairs pulled slightly closer than necessary. As the speeches began, Roisin found her attention drifting, her focus lingering on Aisling. Aisling laughed at a particularly funny anecdote about Maeve's childhood, her eyes sparkling and her cheeks pink from the champagne. Roisin felt her chest tighten, the words she had been holding back for days bubbling to the surface. She wanted to tell her. She needed to tell her. But what if it was too soon? What if Aisling wasn't ready to hear it? What if she wasn't ready to feel the same? Roisin glanced down at her glass, running her thumb along its edge. "You're quiet," Aisling said softly, nudging her elbow. "Everything okay?" Roisin looked up, her green eyes meeting Aisling's. "Yeah," she said, her voice soft. "I was just thinking." "About what?" Aisling asked, tilting her head. "About," Roisin hesitated, her gaze flicking to the dance floor, where Maeve and her new husband were swaying to a slow tune. "About how beautiful today is. And how lucky they are to have found each other." Aisling smiled, her expression wistful. "It is beautiful." Roisin leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Do you think you'd ever want something like this? A wedding, I mean." Aisling blinked, surprised by the question. "I don't know," she admitted. "I used to think I did. But now," she paused, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I guess it depends on who it's with." Roisin's heart skipped a beat, her pulse quickening. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in her throat. Before she could muster the courage, Maeve appeared at their table, her gown billowing as she plopped down beside them with a tired but happy sigh. "Well, aren't you two a picture?" she said with a grin, glancing between them. "Have you danced yet?" Aisling shook her head. "Not yet." Maeve raised an eyebrow, her smile mischievous. "Well, you should. Go on. It's not every day you get to dance under fairy lights." Roisin hesitated, but Aisling stood, holding out her hand with a shy smile. "Shall we?" Roisin took her hand, letting herself be led to the dance floor. As they moved to the soft rhythm of the music, the world around them seemed to blur. It was just the two of them, swaying under the twinkling lights, their steps slow and unhurried. "Aisling," Roisin began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to tell you something." Aisling looked up at her, her blue eyes wide and expectant. "What is it?" Roisin swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. I think I've fallen for you. Maybe it's the wedding, or the music, or just everything about you. But I see you in my future, Aisling. And I want to know if you see me in yours." For a moment, Aisling didn't respond, her expression unreadable. Roisin's stomach twisted with uncertainty, but then Aisling smiled, a soft, radiant smile that made Roisin's chest feel like it might burst. "I think I do," Aisling said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I think I've been seeing you there for days now." Relief washed over Roisin, followed by a warmth that spread through her entire being. She leaned in, her forehead resting against Aisling's as they swayed together, the music and the world around them fading into the background. "Then let's figure it out," Roisin whispered. "Together." Aisling nodded, her fingers tightening around Roisin's. "Together." Whiskey and Wildflowers, Chapter 17, A Night of Laughter and Dreams. The room was bathed in the soft glow of a bedside lamp, its golden light illuminating the pale blue walls and casting faint shadows across the ceiling. The events of the wedding still buzzed faintly in the air, a joyous hum of music, laughter, and clinking glasses that now seemed far away, like a dream. Roisin sat cross-legged on the bed, her red hair tumbling over her shoulders in loose waves. She wore one of Aisling's oversized t-shirts, the fabric hanging off one shoulder. She held a steaming mug of tea in her hands, the faint curl of its aroma mingling with the lingering scent of lavender from the linens. Aisling lay sprawled across the bed, her head propped up on her hand as she watched Roisin with a soft, almost dazed smile. She couldn't stop looking at her, at the way her eyes sparkled when she laughed, the way her lips curved into a grin that seemed to brighten the entire room. "I still can't believe how much champagne Maeve managed to drink," Roisin said, chuckling as she took a sip of her tea. "And she still had the energy to give us a hard time." "She hasn't changed a bit," Aisling said, shaking her head fondly. "I think she's been the same whirlwind of chaos and charm since we were 16. Roisin grinned, setting her tea down on the nightstand. "Well, I think she's rooting for us." "Rooting for us?" Aisling raised an eyebrow, her cheeks flushing slightly. "What does that mean?" Roisin tilted her head, her smile softening. "I think she sees what we have. And I think she wants it to work out." Aisling felt a warmth spread through her chest, her heart swelling with something that felt dangerously close to hope. She glanced down at the quilt beneath her, tracing the pattern with her fingertips. "Do you think it could?" she asked softly. Roisin reached over, taking Aisling's hand in hers. "I know it could," she said simply, her voice steady and sure. "If we want it to." Aisling looked up, her blue eyes meeting Roisin's. The sincerity in her gaze was almost overwhelming, and Aisling felt a lump rise in her throat. "I do," she whispered. "I want it to." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, Roisin leaned in, her hand cupping Aisling's cheek as their lips met in a kiss that was soft and lingering, filled with unspoken promises. Dreams of the future. The night unfolded in a flurry of quiet laughter and whispered confessions. They talked about everything and nothing, their favorite childhood memories, their most embarrassing moments, the things that made them laugh until they cried. They shared silly stories and inside jokes, their voices hushed but warm as the hours slipped away. At one point, Aisling turned to Roisin, her voice soft and tentative. "Do you ever think about the future? About where you'll be in 5 years? 10? Roisin tilted her head, considering the question. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But lately, I've been thinking less about where I'll be and more about who I'll be with." Aisling's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. She hesitated, then reached out, threading her fingers through Roisin's. I think I can see it. Us. Sharing morning tea, bickering over what to watch on TV, moving in together, growing old together." She paused, her cheeks flushing. "Does that sound silly?" Roisin smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Not silly at all. It sounds perfect." Aisling let out a soft laugh, her nerves easing as she leaned into Roisin's side. "I feel so lucky. Like I found you just when I needed you most." "Funny," Roisin murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of Aisling's head. "I was just thinking the same thing." Falling asleep. As the night grew quieter, the weight of the day began to settle over them. Aisling curled up against Roisin, her head resting on her chest. The steady rhythm of Roisin's heartbeat was soothing, a quiet reminder that she wasn't alone. "I don't think I've ever been this happy," Aisling murmured, her voice heavy with sleep. Roisin smiled, her hand brushing gently through Aisling's hair. "You deserve to be," she said softly. "Every bit of it." Aisling's breathing slowed, her body relaxing completely as sleep claimed her. Roisin lay still, watching her for a moment, her heart full to bursting. She pressed a kiss to Aisling's temple, her voice a quiet whisper in the dark. "Good night, love." The room was silent except for the soft sound of their breathing, and as the moonlight streamed through the curtains, Roisin allowed herself to drift into sleep, feeling more content than she ever had before. Whiskey and Wildflowers, Chapter 18, Morning Confessions. The morning sun streamed through the curtains, casting golden rays across the bed. Aisling blinked awake, her body stretching instinctively as she emerged from a deep, dreamless sleep. For a moment, she lay still, savoring the warmth of the blankets and the faint scent of lavender that clung to the room. But then she noticed the absence of Roisin beside her. She sat up, her heart sinking slightly, only to hear the muffled sound of a car door closing outside. Aisling moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside to see Roisin standing by the car, her hair catching the light like a fiery halo. She was focused, loading their bags into the trunk, her movements efficient and unhurried. Aisling's chest tightened at the sight. There was something about Roisin in that moment, so present, so grounded, that made Aisling's heart ache with a strange, beautiful clarity. She thought about the night before, about the laughter and the closeness, and about how Roisin had held her as though she were the most precious thing in the world. She didn't want to wait anymore. The confession. Aisling quickly pulled on a light sweater and stepped outside, the cool morning air brushing against her skin. Roisin turned as she approached, her green eyes lighting up with a smile. "Good morning, sleepyhead," Roisin said, leaning casually against the car. "I didn't want to wake you. Figured I'd get a head start." Aisling smiled faintly, her heart pounding as she stopped a few feet away. She hesitated, her fingers twisting nervously in the hem of her sweater. "What's wrong?" Roisin asked, her smile fading slightly as concern flickered across her face. "Nothing," Aisling said quickly, shaking her head. "It's just, I have something I need to say." Roisin straightened, her posture shifting as she gave Aisling her full attention. "Okay," she said softly. "I'm listening." Aisling took a deep breath, her eyes meeting Roisin's. The words felt heavy and fragile all at once, but she knew she couldn't hold them back any longer. "I love you," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I've never felt this way about anyone before. And I don't know what's ahead or how we'll figure it out, but I know that I love you." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Roisin stared at her, her green eyes wide with surprise, and Aisling's heart clenched with uncertainty. But then, slowly, a smile spread across Roisin's face, soft, radiant, and filled with a warmth that melted away all of Aisling's fears. "I love you too," Roisin said, her voice steady and sure. She stepped closer, her hands coming to rest gently on Aisling's shoulders. "I think I've loved you from the moment you tried to lecture me about road maps." Aisling let out a shaky laugh, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. "You're impossible," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "And you love it," Roisin replied, her grin widening. Aisling nodded, her own smile breaking through the tears as Roisin leaned in, their foreheads touching. For a moment, they simply stood there, wrapped in the quiet intimacy of the morning, the world around them fading into the background. The journey ahead. As they climbed into the car and pulled out of the hotel driveway, the countryside stretched before them, bathed in the golden light of a new day. Aisling glanced over at Roisin, her heart swelling with a mixture of love and gratitude. For the first time in what felt like forever, the road ahead didn't feel uncertain, it felt full of possibility. And as Roisin reached over, her hand finding Aisling's and giving it a gentle squeeze, Aisling knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. Whiskey and Wildflowers, Chapter 19, A New Perspective. The cozy roadside cafe smelled of fresh pastries and coffee, its walls lined with shelves of mismatched mugs and jars of homemade jam. Roisin and Aisling sat at a small table by the window, the morning sun casting warm patterns across their plates. Aisling picked at her croissant, her fingers lightly tearing the flaky edges, while Roisin stirred her tea with absent-minded precision. There was a new ease between them, a softness that lingered in their movements and in the glances they exchanged. "Still thinking about Maeve's wedding?" Aisling asked, a small smile tugging at her lips. Roisin chuckled, leaning back in her chair. "A little. But mostly I'm thinking about how much better this croissant would be if it were a scone." Aisling rolled her eyes, tossing a piece of her croissant at Roisin. "You're impossible." "And yet, here you are," Roisin teased, catching the morsel and popping it into her mouth. They laughed together, their voices mingling with the soft hum of the cafe. For Aisling, it felt like the world had slowed down just enough to let her savor this moment, the warmth of the tea, the sunlight on her skin, and the woman sitting across from her who made everything feel lighter, brighter. On the road. The winding country road stretched out ahead, flanked by rolling green hills and fields dotted with grazing sheep. The car hummed softly as Roisin guided it through the gentle curves, her hands steady on the wheel. Aisling watched her from the passenger seat, her chin resting in her hand. There was something different about the way Roisin was driving now, less reckless, more deliberate. She wasn't rushing or taking sharp turns the way she had earlier in their journey. Instead, her movements were careful, measured, as though she were cradling something fragile. "Are you feeling all right?" Aisling asked, her tone light but curious. Roisin glanced at her, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Why do you ask?" "You're driving like you're afraid to hit a pothole," Aisling said with a small laugh. "It's not like you." Roisin's smile widened, and she looked back at the road. "Maybe I've got something to live for now," she said, her voice soft but filled with meaning. Aisling's breath caught, her cheeks flushing as the words settled between them. She turned to look out the window, hiding the shy smile that spread across her face. "Oh, stop," she murmured, though her voice held no real protest. "I'm serious," Roisin said, her tone gentle. "You're my delicate flower, Aisling. And I'm not about to let anything happen to you." Aisling let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Delicate flower? You're ridiculous." "And yet, here you are," Roisin quipped, her grin audible in her voice. Aisling rolled her eyes, but couldn't help smiling. She reached out, resting her hand lightly on Roisin's arm. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For caring." Roisin glanced at her, her green eyes warm. "Always, love." The road stretched on, the hum of the car filling the comfortable silence between them. Aisling leaned back in her seat, her fingers tracing absent patterns on her knee as she watched the scenery pass by. She felt safe, cradled not just by the careful movements of the car, but by the quiet, unspoken promise in Roisin's actions. And as the countryside unfolded around them, Aisling realized that this was what she had been searching for all along, not just love, but the quiet assurance of being cared for, of being valued. And in Roisin, she had found it. Whiskey and Wildflowers, Chapter 20, A Sudden Danger. The sunlight streamed through the car windows, warming the interior and casting soft patterns across Aisling's face. She leaned against Roisin's shoulder, her body relaxed and her mind adrift in a dreamy haze. The countryside was picture-perfect, with lush green fields, quaint farmhouses, and the occasional grazing animal dotting the landscape. The gentle hum of the car was almost hypnotic, the rhythm soothing in a way that made everything feel distant and safe. But then Aisling's attention flicked to the road ahead, where a car was weaving slightly, its movements erratic and unsettling. "Roisin," Aisling said softly at first, sitting up a little straighter. "Do you see that car?" Roisin's brow furrowed as she glanced up, her hands tightening on the wheel. "Yeah," she said, her voice low with caution. "Looks like they're having trouble staying in their lane." The car ahead swerved again, dipping dangerously close to the center line before jerking back into its own lane. Roisin slowed down, increasing the distance between them. "Drunk driver," Aisling guessed, her voice tinged with unease. "Maybe," Roisin replied, her green eyes narrowing as she watched the car carefully. "Or distracted. Either way, we're keeping our distance." The tension in the car was palpable now, the easy warmth of their earlier conversation replaced by a cold nod of apprehension. The weaving car up ahead slowed suddenly, its brake lights flashing without warning. "Hold on," Roisin said, her voice calm but firm as she eased her foot off the gas and steadied the wheel. The distance she'd kept allowed her to slow gracefully, but her knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Aisling's heart thudded in her chest as she watched the car ahead veer sharply to the right, its wheels kicking up a spray of gravel before it swerved back onto the road. "They're going to crash," she whispered. "Not if I can help it," Roisin muttered, her tone resolute. She glanced at Aisling briefly, her expression steady and reassuring. "We're fine. I've got this." The car ahead continued its erratic movements, but Roisin held her ground, keeping a safe distance and carefully watching for any sign of further danger. As they approached a curve in the road, the weaving car suddenly pulled onto the shoulder, its hazard lights flashing. Roisin exhaled deeply, easing the car back into a steady rhythm as they passed. Aisling turned in her seat, watching as the car disappeared into the distance behind them. "Are they stopping?" she asked, her voice still shaky. "Looks like it," Roisin replied. She reached over, giving Aisling's knee a reassuring squeeze. "They're out of our way now. You all right?" Aisling nodded, though her heart was still racing. "Yeah, I didn't expect that." "Neither did I," Roisin admitted, her tone lighter now. "But we're safe. That's what matters." Aisling relaxed slightly, leaning back in her seat. She glanced at Roisin, her admiration for her growing even deeper. The way she had handled the situation, calm, focused, protective, made Aisling feel even more certain of what she already knew in her heart. "Thanks," Aisling said quietly, her hand covering Roisin's on the gearshift. "For keeping me safe." Roisin glanced at her, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Always, love." As the fields and farmyards continued to pass by, the tension in the car began to fade, replaced once again by the quiet hum of the engine and the comforting rhythm of the road. The danger was behind them, but the bond between them felt stronger than ever. Whiskey and Wildflowers. Chapter 20. The Crash. The tension lingered as Roisin kept a cautious distance behind the erratic car. Aisling sat upright, her eyes locked on the vehicle ahead, the earlier warmth of their journey replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. The road narrowed slightly as they approached a bend, sunlight glinting off the asphalt. The weaving car suddenly jerked to the left, dipping fully into their lane. Roisin, Aisling's voice was sharp with alarm, but the rest of her words were swallowed by the impact. The collision was violent and immediate. The screech of metal against metal echoed through the countryside as Roisin instinctively turned the wheel to minimize the crash. Their car spun, the force wrenching them sideways before it flipped, rolling once, twice, 3 times. Glass shattered, filling the air with a glittering rain of fragments, and the world became a chaotic blur of motion and sound. When the car finally came to rest on its side in a ditch, silence fell. The bright morning had turned into a cruel stillness, broken only by the distant hum of a tractor on a nearby field. Inside the wreckage, Roisin and Aisling lay motionless, their bodies limp and lifeless. The arrival of help. A passerby, a farmer returning from the fields, saw the wreckage and immediately called for help. The National Ambulance Service and Serbi's Nazianta Otherchair arrived swiftly, their flashing lights cutting through the stillness. Paramedics worked quickly, assessing the scene with practiced urgency. "They're both unconscious," one of them said, kneeling beside the wreckage. "We'll need to stabilize them before transport." The women were carefully extracted from the mangled car, their faces pale and their bodies battered. Roisin's arms were still loosely draped around Aisling, as though even in that terrible moment, she had tried to shield her. 2 days later. The sterile scent of the hospital room was the first thing Aisling noticed when she began to stir. Her head throbbed, a dull, insistent ache that seemed to radiate through her entire body. She blinked slowly, the harsh fluorescent lights blurring as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. "Aisling," a voice said softly, and she turned her head slightly to see a nurse standing beside her bed, her expression kind, but serious. "You're in the hospital. You've been in a coma for 2 days. Do you remember what happened?" The memories came rushing back in fragmented pieces, the erratic car, Roisin's sharp intake of breath, the world turning upside down. Aisling's heart clenched, panic rising in her chest. "Roisin," she whispered, her voice hoarse and weak. "Where's Roisin?" The nurse hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She stepped closer, her eyes soft with compassion. Aisling, she began gently, her voice trembling just enough to betray her sorrow. I'm so sorry. Roisin didn't make it. Aisling stared at her, the words washing over her like ice. No, she said, shaking her head weakly. That's not. She was right there with me. She can't be gone. The nurse's eyes glistened as she sat down beside Aisling's bed. She passed very quickly, she said softly. She didn't feel any pain. And when we found you, she had her arms around you. Like she was trying to protect you. Tears blurred Aisling's vision, spilling over as a choked sob escaped her lips. No, she whispered again, her voice breaking. She can't be gone. The nurse reached out, placing a gentle hand on Aisling's arm. I'm so sorry, she said quietly. She cared about you so much. It was clear in everything she did. Aisling turned her face into the pillow, her body racked with silent sobs. The emptiness in her chest was unbearable, a hollow ache that threatened to swallow her whole. She clung to the memory of Roisin's smile, her laugh, the way she had held her just days before as they danced beneath fairy lights. She loved me, Aisling whispered, her voice cracking. And I didn't get to tell her again. The nurse stayed by her side, offering what little comfort she could. Outside the window, the sun shone brightly, mocking the grief that filled the room. But even in the midst of her despair, Aisling clung to one small, fragile truth. Roisin had loved her, and she had tried to protect her until the very end.